Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Improving the Patient Experience in Cancer, presented by CareVive. I'm Andrea Anderson, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Ethan Bosch, Chief, Division of Oncology, Physician-in-Chief, UNC Cancer Hospital. Stacy Hudgens, Chief Executive Officer, Clinical Outcomes Solutions. Tanya Wilds, Consultant, Geriatric Oncology and Hematology, Cancer and Aging Research Group. Bruno Lumpernies, Chief Executive Officer, CareVive. Madeline Trupkin-Herzfeld, Founder and Vice Chair, CareVive. And Mordecai Kramer, VP, Data Generation and Outcomes, Life Sciences at CareVive. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. All right, let's begin. Bruno, please go ahead.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. Welcome to our CareVive webinar to learn about the patient experience in cancer. I'm Bruno Lumpernies, Chief Executive Officer of CareVive. So this afternoon, we're together to accomplish 4 goals and answer the following question. Number 1, explore. Why do we measure patient experience in cancer? 2, evaluate. How do we measure it? 3, observe. What does the experience of a patient with cancer look like? And 4, implement. What can different healthcare stakeholders do with our data to improve patient care across the life science value chain? But first, before we go deeper in the agenda, a few words about who we are at CareVive. So we were founded in 2013 to better engage cancer patients and their care team. Today, we have the most holistic cancer care management platform on the marketplace in the US. We have about 26 hospital-based health system customers using our platform on a daily basis. We're really committed to high-quality science focus with over 60 scientific presentations and publications demonstrating decreased ED visits, hospitalizations, better care coordination, improved treatment decision-making. We've been working closely with all our clients and oncology care teams and users to continuously improve and support the product refinement. And the clinical team of CareVive is comprised of doctorate and master's degree oncology nurses and internationally renowned scientific advisory board as well. We're backed by investors who have a huge expertise and footprint in the healthcare and life science space. Now, let's dive into our agenda, and we will start with Dr. Ethan Bosch, who will explore with us why we measure patient experience in cancer.
Thank you very much, Bruno, and it's a pleasure to be here today with you. So as background, I think it goes without saying that symptoms are extremely common during cancer treatment, particularly for patients who have advanced disease, but also in the adjuvant setting. This is related to the cancer itself, but also to the treatments, which can be very toxic. And the downstream consequences of poorly controlled symptoms can be severe, including interference with physical functioning, but also interference with the ability to administer treatment. And we know that poorly controlled symptoms are one of the leading causes of avoidable emergency room visits and hospitalizations. As a result, symptom management is a cornerstone of quality care for oncology. Prior research, however, has demonstrated that that we clinicians, unfortunately, are unaware of up to half of our patients' symptoms. This is for a host of reasons that have to do with the logistics of visits and connectivity between visits. And as alluded to in the prior slide, a downstream consequence of us missing our patients' symptoms and not intervening soon enough is that the symptoms can go poorly controlled and lead to complications. Systematic monitoring of symptoms with digital monitoring with electronic patient-reported outcomes can close this gap. It provides an avenue for monitoring patients in real time and flagging problems for providers to intervene. We know from prior research that patients are willing and able, and in fact, generally highly enthusiastic to self-report their own symptoms. And clinicians trust this information and will use it for their healthcare decision-making. I want to make a quick comment about the feasibility of collecting patient-reported outcomes in care. When patients self-report in a real-world setting rather than a clinical trial setting, one can expect to see between 60 and 80% compliance of patients at any given time point. In clinical trials, it can be much higher. It can be 90 to 95%. But again, in the routine care setting, we can expect 60 to 80%. And there are a number of measures that can be used in order to increase the compliance of patients, such as good engagement of staff, responsiveness of staff to notifications about severe or worsening patient symptoms, and messaging to the patients clearly that this is a part of care that we value. In addition, having a technology that's easy to use and access is essential for high patient compliance. I'm going to mention a study that my group reported at the ASCO annual meeting in 2017 as a plenary presentation and was published in JAMA. This was the STAR study, in which a large population of patients receiving chemotherapy for solid tumors at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center were randomly assigned either to an intervention with digital symptom monitoring with ePROs or to control. In the intervention arm, patients were given access to a web-based system where they could report 12 of their symptoms on a weekly basis, and anytime a symptom was severe or worsening, an email or message would be sent to the in-basket of the nurses on the team to alert them to this problem. In addition, reports of the patient's longitudinal trajectories of symptoms could be printed for the teams at visits. Patients were enrolled throughout their cancer treatment. Again, this was a population of patients with advanced and metastatic cancers, and a number of outcomes were evaluated, including impact on patients' quality of life, emergency room and hospital utilization, and overall survival. 766 patients were enrolled. The overall survival analysis was done in 2016, and the quality of life analysis found that at 6 months compared to baseline, compared to standard care for those patients who were in the ePRO monitoring group, there was a 31% improvement or increase in the percent of patients who experienced quality of life benefits. So about a third of patients had quality of life benefits with ePRO monitoring compared to standard care. In addition, compared to standard care, 7% fewer patients in the self-reporting arm visited the emergency room with durable effects throughout the study. This was a highly statistically significant finding, and similar findings were seen for hospitalization. So again, monitoring patients with ePROs, a simple technological intervention can drive down emergency room visits substantially. And finally, overall survival, which I think was the finding that garnered the most interest. Compared to standard care, median overall survival was 5.2 months longer among patients with self-reporting. And this remained significant across all multivariable analyses. And this translated to a 5-year absolute survival benefit of 8%, greater than the majority of drugs approved by the FDA for oncology indications in that same year. I'm going to pass it back to Mordecai now, I believe.
sort of what CareVive does, how we do it, and a little bit more about our data collection process. So CareVive was founded, as Bruno mentioned, in 2013. So we've been around the block for a while, always with the mission to illuminate what's the real world cancer patient experience and how do we use those data to make cancer care more patient-centered, get to better outcomes, as Ethan described, at lower costs. So how do we do that? We also talked about how CareVive has sort of the most holistic digital platform in the market. So we have a number of assessments when a patient is contemplating treatment to help make a more patient-centered treatment decision with the care team. And once a treatment decision is determined, then CareVive generates this patient-specific care plan for the patient, which is typically introduced by a navigator, who also at that time enrolls the patient onto CareVive Prompt. And that's our remote therapeutic monitoring platform that is disease and treatment specific. It's typically assessments generated every week. We are deeply integrated into the electronic health record, where you can see a patient's longitudinal data within the context of that record. As Ethan mentioned, we do send alerts to the care team if it's something that needs to be addressed. And that's also in the electronic health record. And at the same time, we send self-management education back to the patient in real time. Coming in 2022, we are just wrapping up an exciting multi-million-dollar grant from the National Cancer Institute, where we've put forth several cancer symptom pathways to help drive better management of cancer symptoms. Once patients come off of active treatment, our system generates a survivorship care plan, and we can also use Prompt to monitor patients in the non-acute setting for early detections of recurrences. We're pulling all of those data together with the intentions of continuously improving practice, which I'll talk to you a little bit more. We do that in the context of the CareVive opt-in program. And that stands for the Oncology Pragmatic Trial Investigator Network. And this is where 18 of our sites currently are participating. We are aggregating and de-identifying all the data. Number one, we're looking at, is it feasible to collect real-world PROs in a routine care setting? But we're also creating quarterly reports, which actually Stacey Hudgens is helping us on, and she's presenting next, where we're looking at by cancer type, what do baseline PROs and PROs trajectories tell us about how we can predict better the patient experience? And of course, we're bringing those data back to this network so that we can continuously improve practice to be able to better predict, but then also looking at how patients are being managed, how symptoms are being managed, what's working, what's not working, to better inform care. So that's a little bit about who we are. We are doing the opt-in program right now in 6 different cancer types: multiple myeloma, lung cancer, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, AML, and CML. And as I mentioned, with each registry, we have a quarterly report defining those outcomes. So thank you very much. I think that's all I have, and I am going to pass it back.
Observations in the year of follow-up data that is available through the CareVive platform. So what we're demonstrating here is the patient adherence to completing the weekly surveys. The yellow line demonstrates that over a year of follow-up, some patients have been using the platform for that long, they remain highly persistent with using the application, with nearly 90% completion rate for the assigned surveys, which really is quite high in real-world experience and mimics what was seen in Dr. Bash's original clinical trials. Here we highlight some of the data that's collected at baseline, as well as some of the data that's examined longitudinally, and some of these quite unique to the CareVive platform. This information is influential in individualizing treatment recommendations. So for example, at baseline, patients are asked to self-report on their preferences regarding their cancer treatment, specifically on where they land with regard to how they prioritize length of life versus quality of life. And this information can really help a clinician determine if a treatment meets that individual's preferences regarding the trade-offs of efficacy and toxicity. As you can see here, the majority of patients prefer that their treatment helps them to maintain their quality of life, but length of life is also important to them. Others wholly prioritize quality of life, and others really prioritize length of life, a patient who may undergo a more aggressive treatment to meet that preference. The platform also gathers data on the patient's functional status and comorbidities. With cancer being a disease of aging, this can allow calculation of a frailty status. It is widely known that clinicians don't gather all the data necessary in older patients to truly understand the heterogeneity of aging, and having data on the patient's frailty status may help influence the clinician's appraisal of the older adult's resiliency and risk of toxicity. Next, the platform allows monitoring of the patient's adherence to oral cancer treatments. It may be difficult or uncomfortable for a patient to disclose to the clinical team that they're having difficulty adhering to the medications. The platform allows the individual to disclose that, and then talk about what factors are contributing to their difficulty adhering. As you can see here, of the patients who have reported this on these items so far, most say that they are always able to take their medication, but there are a proportion of patients who are having difficulty with adhering to their oral cancer therapy. And then when we look at what the reasons for that difficulty with adherence are, it could be side effects, lack of understanding of the need for the medication, reminders, and so forth. So this allows the clinical team to address the specific reason for difficulty with adherence and connect the patient with appropriate supports, be that improved management of their side effects, medication reminders, education about the need for the medication, or copay assistance if the needs are financial. With the ongoing monitoring of symptoms, this allows clinicians to be aware of trends in the patient's symptoms. Alerts allow for timely intervention of worsening symptoms. As you can see in this one example here, this individual patient had worsening of pain that peaked and prompted an alert to the clinical team. The team was then able to inquire about the nature of the pain and prescribe new pain medications, resulting in really prompt improvement in the pain and for the patient to resume their daily activities pain-free. So in summary, we've seen in real-world use that the patients are showing us the feasibility of using the platform. They are persisting in using the platform over months, or in some cases as long as a year of using the platform. And we are finding that self-report of aspects of health, including social determinants of health, functional status, and care preferences, is feasible and impacts decision-making in the clinic. And then clinicians are using the data to make actionable decisions and improve the care and quality of life of their patients. So I will turn it over to Stacey Hudgens, CEO of Clinical Outcome Solutions, who will discuss how the CareVive patient experience data can benefit the cancer ecosystem.
Hello. I want to talk just briefly about, now I need to advance the slides. Sorry, there we go. I want to talk about the implementation in the regulatory setting. I'm sorry, I can't. I want to talk just briefly about how there is a multi-stakeholder benefit, and also just talk a bit about regulatory decision making in this area with the incorporation of the 21st Century Cures Act and several guidances by the FDA around real world evidence generation and data that drives that decision making, such as data sources to inform health status, product and or registry data. What the CareVive system allows us to do is not only quantify the patient experience, but it allows us to track symptom experience for individuals and groups of patients in, as Maddie indicated, different cancer types, but also different treatment areas over time. We're also able to monitor and quantify different treatment pathways for patients along the way. And so this allows us to influence treatment decision making, but it also contributes to the real world evidence generation to support regulatory interactions. And so as the CareVive team works very hard to influence treatment decision making, they're also generating critical data, as Ethan suggested, around patient reported symptoms and tolerability, each of which has been categorized by the FDA Oncology Center of Excellence as critical core outcomes in the patient journey for new drug development. So the potential for these data that is really engaging to see is the ability to look cross-sectionally at data, but also longitudinal statistical models for assessing patient outcome. So we're able to see in the acute and subacute periods of treatment, so as a patient who may be treatment naive comes into a new treatment, how their symptoms and their tolerability endpoints change over time. Additionally, it will allow us, as part of the real world evidence generation, to possibly conduct indirect treatment comparisons, particularly when there's a single arm study. As identified in the FDA guidances, there is the ability possibly to use real world data as controls for single arm studies. And so as we think about that on the scientific side of the use of CareVive data, the use of being able to collect and talk about indirect treatment comparisons in terms of symptoms, function, and quality of life actually becomes actualized. And finally, as Maddie presented, it's the generation of key reports that are accessible to all stakeholder groups. So moving beyond regulators, it allows us to interact with patients and caregivers and clinicians to monitor the symptom profile, not only for us as patients, but also for families of patients with cancer. And so these data offer the opportunity to meet not only regulatory evidentiary requirements, but also to inform the real world experience for patients, which is critical. And I just want to add and go back to the earlier examples, the graphical visualization of these data makes data quite accessible to all end users. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy. Now you've seen what smart data is. It is symptom monitoring with applied remote technology, a novel way to capture the patient experience and derive new insights from the data presented in the voice of the cancer patients themselves. So to summarize today's learning objectives, Ethan helped us to explore how amplifying the patient voice in cancer care can actually improve their outcomes over time. Maddie evaluated with us how using a novel digital oncology platform can help better bridge clinicians and their patients. Tanya helped us observe what a holistic cancer patient experience looks like, the types of data that we capture, and the types of insights that can be generated from them, particularly as patients are adherent over a long period of time. As mentioned, a number of patients over a year already in completing weekly PROs to provide data about this holistic cancer patient experience. And Stacy gave us some ideas about how the data can be used within the broader ecosystem to, again, provide benefit, insights, and an interesting novel data source. But there is lots of work to be done on the implementation side, and we look forward to continued conversation with many of you who are attending the webinar today. A few quick thank yous. Thanks to everybody who attended the webinar today, of course. We hope you learned something new and look forward to further conversation with you all. Thank you to all of our esteemed presenters for sharing many years of experience and hard work in this field. Thanks to our growing list of life science sponsors who are supporting us. Thanks to the Fierce team for all of their hard work. And of course, thank you to all of the CareVivers who dedicate themselves to this critical mission every single day. I will now hand it back over to our moderator, Andrea, to address your questions. We have plenty of time left and really look forward to digging into your questions.
Thank you so much. It is time to move on to the Q&A. There's still time to submit your questions using the Q&A tab to the left of your screen. We have a lot of great questions already, and we will try to get to as many as possible. For the first question, how can clinicians improve patient care using the platform? Maddie, could you handle this question for us?
I'm sorry, you went out. Can you say it one more time?
Yes, here's the first question. How can clinicians improve patient care using the platform?
A great question. Well, hopefully we went through that today, just showing you sort of end to end, getting the patient's input when you're making a treatment decision and making sure it's a shared decision, and having the best data you can to make the best possible decision for a patient. And then monitoring patients over time, as Ethan has shown in his pivotal clinical trials. We know that monitoring patients and proactively managing them leads to better outcomes.
Thank you for that, Maddie. For our next question, what type of data are you collecting and what is unique about it? Mordecai, could you answer that?
Sure. Our novel smart data set consists of a combination of data extracted from the EMR to paint a contextual picture of the patient, data fields such as basic demographics, age, sex, race, ethnicity, diagnosis, and types of medications that the patient is receiving. And we combine that with the longitudinal patient-reported outcomes, holistic data that we're collecting about the patient experience week in and week out to inform things such as symptoms, quality of life, physical function, healthcare resource utilization, and a number of other important things that we collect to paint that overall picture. And this combination of data is really unique in the space right now, and hopefully, as you all learned today, can provide some really interesting insights, particularly as we follow patients over a very long span of time while they are on treatment.
Thank you for that. This next question is for Maddie. What are challenges to clinician adoption of the platform?
Oh goodness. So of course we're breaking through in terms of implementation science of how do you remotely monitor patients. So we're sensitive today for health systems that are coming out with COVID, and the hardships that the oncology care teams have faced during this pandemic, and really helping them to be thinking sort of more towards the future and transformation and how do we continuously improve cancer care. So I would say the biggest hardship right now is just around resources and thoughtful planning, and that's something that CareVive has worked really, really hard over the past year, being really thoughtful about how we can guide sites on implementation, design the implementation process, and be there to see them successfully through it. So we've made significant investments in the implementation framework.
All right, a question for Tanya. Do you share data back with clinicians?
Yes, on the individual level, the individual clinician will obviously see the data input by their individual patient on a dashboard and in graphical form and so forth. But the clinicians and the sites also will have access to the aggregated, de-identified data, both for local quality improvement initiatives and their own research questions as well.
Another question for Mordecai this time. Why is your adherence so high?
Adherence is high for a number of reasons. One, we know that patients with cancer want to be extremely engaged in their care, and they want to share information about themselves so they can help other people in the ecosystem, and that makes them incredibly remarkable in that way. And we're appreciative of all of them who contribute their data to us in this way, and proud to be the custodians of that. In addition, the way the platform was designed, and you got a taste of that as well through Maddie's slide, it's to promote constant feedback between clinicians and patients, so that when patients are reporting symptoms at any point in time that are moderate, severe, and certainly very severe, the care team is alerted to that and can respond to the patient right away and help them mitigate that symptom. This, as Ethan's data shown, can help prevent avoidable hospitalizations and ER visits. And even when patients only report mild or moderate symptoms, the CareVive platform sends them a little customized PDF that knows that they've just experienced that symptom and gives them some self-care tips to hopefully mitigate the symptom on their own, but again, reminds them that if they're still in distress, that they can call their care team, reminds them of the phone numbers to do that. So we're constantly promoting this ongoing dialogue and information back and forth that patients find helpful and keeps them engaged week after week.
For the next question, this will be for Stacy. Would these types of data be able to be included in an FDA submission?
Yes, hi. Per the FDA guidances and the draft guidances that are out on the use of real-world data to inform real-world evidence, as I indicated earlier, which is specified in the draft guidance, I think it is critical to note that data will be reviewed as suggested by the FDA in terms of evidence to support specific products for regulatory decision making in terms of efficacy and safety. The one highlight is the type of data source and the data uses. And so as CareVive moves forward for very specific data usages, if they align the scientific inquiry to regulatory decision making, I think it could be very informative.
Thank you for that. Another question for Ethan. Are the real-world data that you are seeing consistent with clinical trial results?
So there have been clinical trials looking at the impact of patient-reported outcomes on clinical endpoints, showing the improvements that I described: hospitalization, quality of life, survival, et cetera. And those have also been looked at not just in the prospective clinical research setting, but also have been looked at in large population data. So a group in Ontario, Canada, did a population study in over 128,000 patients who were routinely collecting, or the patients were routinely providing PROs in oncology practices across the province. And they found similar impact on quality of life, survival, and hospitalization. So I would say that these findings of the positive impact of digital monitoring with PROs have been seen both in a very controlled clinical research setting, but also in a real-world general population health setting.
Right, another question. Are the insights or findings specific to community, academic, cancer centers, or both? Let's have Ethan answer this one as well.
Yeah, I can answer that. Benefits have been seen in both. So prospective studies looking at the impact of PROs have been done both in tertiary cancer centers, hospital-based practices, but also in community oncology practices. And the findings tend to be durable across contexts.
Thanks for that, Ethan. Another question to clarify, is CareVive an EMR platform for an MD office to use? Maddie, could you answer that one?
So we are independent of the electronic health record. We do build tight integrations with the electronic health record. The most sophisticated integration we have is with Cerner Corporation. They're also investors in our company. And the integrations are twofold. So one is a data integration where we seamlessly pass over data, clinical data, from the electronic health record into our platform, so there's no need for dual entry of data. But then there's also workflow integrations. So what we mean by that is we are smart enabled, so you see our dashboards within the context of the record, but we're also able to send alerts from the patient to the message center. So we have configurations for alerting that, if significant enough, an alert will be sent into the electronic health record message center, similar to how a significant lab value behaves. And then we also auto document back into the electronic health record any intervention that was done for the symptom.
All right, another question here. Do you find that healthcare professionals are making good use of the data you collect, or is there still work to be done for them to utilize the data effectively? How do you see them using it effectively in the real world? Maddie, could you answer this one as well?
Sure. So we're just starting to do this work with our sites in our deep implementation planning. And so I'll give you an example of one site who's very interested in looking at time to symptom resolution. So using the data continuously to say, okay, we have these 50 symptoms, these 50 patients that are on the platform. Here's how their symptoms are progressing or resolving. Here's the management strategies that have been put in place that maybe accelerated the symptoms from resolving. So we create the reports then back to the administrators and to the nursing managers to use for continuous practice improvement. So I would say in real time, you could and should be looking at the data to continuously improve practice.
Another question, how does the onboarding process with patients look? Are patients enrolled in office, or does it happen after the fact as a follow-up? Maddie, could you answer that one too?
Oh, sure. I'm getting a lot of questions. So the onboarding practice, while we recommend, and a lot of this came out of Ethan's work and a lot of the early champions in this, is that it is typically introduced in the office by the care team. It's important that the patient knows that this is something that is important to the care team for the patients to participate. And once they are enrolled, obviously the follow-up and monitoring in between clinic visits happens remotely.
All right, another question. Previous studies have shown that clinicians don't always respond to symptom alerts. Are you measuring whether or not there is a response to alerts? Mordecai, could you address this one?
Sure. We are being very diligent about tracking the alert workflows. It's very important for the sites as they're using the CareVive platform as part of their standard of care to be able to use the platform as designed, which is to be able to provide response to patients in a timely fashion and help them manage their symptoms better in as real-time a way as possible. So we're able to track, of course, the flow of information as it comes from the patient to the clinician. And of course, that's all time stamped. And we also know when the care team is responding to the patient, what that response is, whether it involves prescribing a new drug, eliminating a drug that they're taking, or some other recommendation. And then, of course, we're able to track what happens to the patient afterwards and be able to see if the symptom resolved over time or if there were additional alerts that were triggered and ongoing management of the patient. So we have all this data, and it also tells a very unique and interesting story, but ultimately is being very helpful in the direct daily care setting for these patients.
Thank you. Another question. Just wondering if anyone knows about some sort of concierge or patient navigator service for cancer patients. This person is asking on behalf of a patient that is struggling to understand the treatment process and struggling with the logistical challenges associated with treatment. Ethan, could you answer that first for us?
I don't know that I'm in a position to answer that. As an academic researcher who sees patients at a large tertiary center, we have our own navigation services. So I might defer that to one of the other speakers about whether there are concierge services that are related to that.
Tanya or Maddie, do either of you have a comment?
I'm happy to jump in unless Tanya, you had something. It is something we're looking at, across our centers. A lot of people, as I mentioned before, I guess another question that came to me is the challenges, right? And the challenges, people are spread pretty thin right now across the cancer team. So at CareVive, sort of as a strategy, we're looking at care management services that perhaps we can augment for our sites. I don't know, Tanya, if you had anything.
No, I was just going to say that typically is associated with the cancer center. I'm not familiar of anything that is larger, because much of the navigation really is institution specific about where scans might be held and things like that. But it does sound like a gap and a need there.
Moving on to another question. How can smaller hospital centers with limited resources implement ePros? Ethan, could you answer that?
Sure. I think that electronic patient-reported outcomes for digital monitoring can be implemented in almost any setting. The technology itself is relatively straightforward. I think that the challenge is the modifications in workflow at the practice and having personnel who can respond to the information. So if you think about it, this is a technology that really enhances something that we already do, de rigueur as a part of practice. Right, symptom monitoring is foundational in cancer care, right? Any practice, no matter what its size, is dealing with patient symptoms. They may call on the phone, or if there's some kind of connected portal system, they can send an electronic message, or they discuss symptoms at the visits. And then there's somebody in the practice or multiple people who address those things, right? So if a patient calls on the phone with a symptom, there's somebody who checks that message and gets back to the patient and manages it. These electronic systems, all they do is enhance that, right? They improve communication between visits such that the patient will be using an application, they'll report a symptom, and then that's directed to the same person who will be checking the voicemails or checking the patient portal messages. So any practice of any size can do this if they are engaged in symptom management, which I assume every practice dealing with oncology patients is. So I'd say it's not really a limitation. In fact, I would argue that it's probably easier to onboard this for a smaller practice than for a larger practice where technology implementations sometimes have more layers of approvals and implementation complexity.
Tanya, did you have a follow-up to that one?
Yeah, I was just going to say that from the standpoint of helping the workflow, that sitting in my exam room, sometimes a patient won't have reported symptoms by phone in advance of a busy clinic day, but then will come in with substantial symptom burden, which had I known about them earlier, I could have been intervening and getting appropriate workup done in advance of seeing them in the clinic. And so as opposed to making the workflow harder, it can actually make it more efficient so that our face-to-face time, which is so valuable, could be spent discussing the imaging results that I'd gotten in advance of seeing them, that sort of thing.
All right, another question. Are there liability concerns from healthcare professionals if they receive an alert they do not address in a timely fashion? Tanya, could you answer that for us?
It is a very good question. And, I have not personally worked with having the platform in my workflow. And so I'm not certain how they ensure that the alerts are observed and informing the patients that, the urgent things need to, on the weekends, go to the ER, things like that. But I don't see it as any different as a phone call that informing us of symptoms that we need to act on urgently as well. I don't know if anyone else on the call has insight.
Yeah, I can address it. These platforms have legal disclaimers on them, the same as patient portal systems do, right? So the patient portals are ubiquitous. They're used widely in medicine across all disciplines, and patients send in messages just as patients leave voicemails, and messages can be missed. Messages can be delayed. in their responses, and so there are generally standard legal disclaimers to minimize exposure or to eliminate exposure, such as this form of communication cannot be relied upon as the sole means of connecting with your practice. If you have a severe problem requiring attention, call 911 or come to your doctor's office or the emergency room or call the doctor, et cetera, something like that. So there have not been any cases that I'm aware of where there has been liability related to these kinds of systems. Right. This is just yet another form of communication in addition to other forms of communication. I'm sorry, Maddie, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I didn't hear the question, but I think I know what it was. And that's a big part sort of our implementation, even in the scripts when we're onboarding. We educate the patient. This is not an emergency service. This is for us to track you longitudinally all over the platform. We continue to reiterate that. And then also the patient can pick which day every week they want to report their symptoms. And a lot of times clinicians block, they don't even allow for like a Friday to submit your surveys on Fridays because they don't want that stuck on over a weekend. So there's a number of mechanisms that we have put in place to optimize the communications and mitigate risk. But all over the platform, we do explain very deeply that the intention here is not emergency management. If there's an emergency, call 911 or go to the ER.
Thank you for those responses. For our next question, one concern we have is mitigating alert fatigue coming in the electronic patient-reported outcomes systems. So can you address those concerns? Let's have Maddie answer that one.
Sure. So this is another thing Ethan has offered a lot of guidance to us on, and we're working on configurations that really limit that. So looking at severe configurations, looking at, if something goes from nothing to moderate, we're looking at asking the patient, is this something you need a call back on? Embedding that into the platform, but a number of different strategies. We're constantly looking, and I know Ethan's even looking like at machine learning to really be able to understand alert management and how do we do it in a scalable way. So Ethan, I don't know if there's more you want to add. You're way more of an expert on this than I am.
Yeah, I can comment. These alerts from the system, I liken to the pager that I wear, right? When my pager goes off, it's disruptive, but I'm glad that it goes off because I need to know what's happening with my patients so that I can be reactive. The alerts are the same way. They are important information, but if there are too many messages that mount up in somebody's inbox, that can be a burden. And we know from nurses who are generally the recipients of these messages that they feel that unless time is allotted for this activity of checking the alerts, it feels like a burden. So for any implementation, I think there was another question about staffing and staff time for fielding PRO alerts. Any implementation needs to carve out time for the nurses or the navigators, whoever's getting the alerts, to clear those alerts. To address them, whether it's by calling patients or documentation. And if you don't clear that time, and it's probably a very modest amount of time, but if you don't clear that amount of time, then it's just piled on top of everything else. And particularly during the last 2 years, we've all learned that any new encumbrances on our time as clinicians can really feel like a substantial burden. The problem isn't necessarily the alerts per se. The alerts are legitimate representations of needs of the patients that should be addressed by the practice. The issue is having adequate staff bandwidth and time to address it. And again, that's probably somewhere in the range of about 5% of the time of the clinical nurse or navigator who's overseeing a standard size population of patients in oncology practice. That said, I will underline what Maddie said, which is there's a lot of ongoing work to reduce the number of alerts and to make the alerts easier to address and to clear. And that's, I'd say, an area of high interest in digital monitoring. But nonetheless, there will continue to be alerts, and so we have to plan for that when we implement.
Thanks for those responses. More questions here. This one is for Stacy. What are you looking forward to publishing next?
Oh, well, in the real world space, I'm particularly interested in comparative tolerability for individual treatment pathways. Just having worked in the clinical trial setting for a very long time, the real world setting offers the ability to look at treatment decision makings along the longitudinal path for a patient. And so I'm very excited to continue some of the work that Dr. Bosch and I have done with Friends of Cancer on comparative tolerability, and really starting to use real world data to understand comparative tolerability against treatments that are on market now, but also considering different data uses for real world evidence generation.
Thanks for that. This question will be for Bruno. What type of data products do you see developing in the future? I think you might be muted, Bruno.
I think I'm not, right? Hear me now?
We can hear you now, yes.
Okay, so already with the data we have, which Mordecai described earlier, we are already serving a large spectrum of, say, users of this type of data, from the provider clinicians who want to know what's happening in the practice, combining this clinical data and the ePROS data, and also the life science companies who have different objectives and goals using this type of data. We're also working on building up a library of syndicated reports for large cancer population that we're covering today, but also for rare population. And a part of the work we're also doing is moving from only using this data to describe what's happening, but to predict what's happening. There's a lot about predictability and using the symptoms, and after seeing a series of symptoms, are we going to be able to predict what's going to be the next symptoms and the treatment pathway, the symptom pathway rather of the patients. So a lot of exciting developments we're doing with this type of data.
Another question, how have you seen this data as part of SOC impact clinician workload?
I'll step in, and I think Ethan kind of alluded to this earlier too, this is just changing the timing of the workflow. The patients are going to be having the symptoms whether they report them to us in real time or wait until their next clinic visit. And so this is just giving the opportunity for more timely intervention, kind of just redistributing the workload a little bit differently than it is in standard of care. That's my perception.
I think that's right. We know that by monitoring symptoms and becoming aware of those symptoms earlier, clinicians intervene before things become severe or complicated. And so, as we saw in the data, we drive down ER visits. It also means that fewer patients are arriving in clinic in extremis, which tends to tie up a lot of provider time, right? Having to arrange for either admission or IV fluids or whatever. And so there's really an upstream shift of staff time. Now you're spending more time on small incremental issues, all these little alerts that are coming in, intervening early in order to avoid a small number of very time consuming complex complications if symptoms are not well controlled. Nonetheless, as I mentioned before, I still advocate for protecting a little bit of nursing time or navigation time to deal with the alerts, even though probably it evens out at the end of the day. There is a perception of more work by the people who are receiving the alerts. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that they're now going to be spending time doing this. But I think probably on balance, staffing maybe is about the same with this setup.
Thanks for those answers. A question for Tanya. What are you looking for among the geriatric patients in the data set? What is most important to you?
Great, thank you for that question. Wanted to highlight that the geriatrics is not just a unique niche. This is 2/3 of the patients with cancer. It's a disease of aging, and accumulating data. In fact, outside of this today, the International Society of Geriatric Oncology conference is going on and demonstrating accumulating data that taking into account these aging factors like comorbidities and daily activities are going to help improve the care of our older cancer patients. Some of the things that I'm anxious to do with the platform is integrating the information that we're gathering. Things like identifying patients who may have some dependence in their daily activities and who don't really identify an individual as their care partner. And just recognizing that in advance of a patient developing increased dependence and needing more help, kind of helping plan ahead in an anticipatory way. And then also just seeing the implementation of these geriatric screening factors and how they influence the clinicians to thinking about selecting the right treatment for an older cancer patient, kind of helping us mitigate ageism rather than making cancer treatment decisions based on age, really tailoring it to the older individual's level of fitness.
Another question. Have you partnered with any specialty pharmacies for similar data outcomes and also as a liaison to the patient or MD? Maddie, would you like to address that one? Maddie, you're on mute.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. So you can address that question now.
I said we have not worked with a specialty pharmacy, but whoever asked that question, we would love to talk further with you about your idea.
All right, we have time for one more question. It'll be our final question. We had a lot of great questions today and we couldn't get to them all, but we will try our best to get back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. So for our last question, has this platform been used as part of clinical trials to capture AEs? Anyone want to jump in for that one?
I can take that one.
I'll jump in. Oh, go for it. Yeah, go for it.
I'll start. It has not been used to date, although we have submitted a couple of proposals to life science companies who are interested and see the adaptability of the platform for that purpose. And from a compliance perspective, it is pretty much ready to go, but primarily our focus has been on the real world patients to collect data on them as a bit of an underserved market with the unmet needs there, and ultimately be able to compare those to clinical trial populations as well. But from a pure platform applicability perspective, it's certainly within the realm of the possible. I would love to learn more about that, explore that more.
Anything to add, Maddie?
No, just to say that we've been very hyper-focused right now on the real world setting and collecting data for patients who are on standard of care treatments.
Thank you for those responses. And thanks to all of you for attending this FiercePharm webinar and for submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and CareVive for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.